My industrial training year, August 1976 to August 1977, at South African Pulp and Paper Industries, Springs, near Johannesburg, Transvaal, South Africa. This was the third year of my degree course in chemical engineering at Surrey University. Dr. Clutterbuck called me into his office. "Well, Michael, we have a position for you at a chemical plant in Grimsby, or you might want to consider a job at a paper mill in South Africa." It took me about 2 seconds to decide. Long-distance travel was still exotic in those days. Communications were slow, airmail letters were the norm, so the thought of being away from home and out of touch for a year was daunting. Finally, however, the visas were in place, inoculation and health screening certificates and airline tickets were in my hands, and off I went. After a long flight on the newly introduced Boeing 747, I arrived at Johannesburg Airport. It was odd having armed militia all around, and it was my first inkling that perhaps this wasn't going to be the paradise I had in mind. However, I was met and driven some 30 miles to the company's men's single quarters near the factory, where I was given dinner, with various unidentifiable ingredients, albeit quite tasty, and settled in. A little background here. In 1976, South Africa operated under the apartheid system, with strict segregation of people according to colour and race. As a result, there were many international trade sanctions in place against the country. I hadn't paid this aspect too much attention before my departure, as a naive 20-year-old, but being confronted on my first day by a bewildering assortment of signs, whites only, Bantu canteen, non-whites area, led to some wry smiles from others as they watched me trying to find a place to eat my lunch. Back in London, anti-apartheid protest marches were being held, whilst in the South African townships like Soweto, the residents were frequently rioting for better conditions. This was not reported on the local news, of course, but, thanks to the efficient university mail system, I received regular monthly copies of the student magazine Bare Facts, bringing me up to date with the Surrey goings-on, as well as the latest anti-apartheid news, which was that year's big topic. The Sappi factory was amazing. Although a dirty site, the ingenuity of the local engineers to create a self-sufficient operation, remember the trade sanctions, meant that I was watching old steam trains arriving, carrying only salt and logs at one end of the site, whilst finished paper products and some byproducts, bleach and chlorine gas cylinders, were shipped out from the other end. All heating and power were generated on site by burning the wood pulping waste. My work involved looking at process improvements across the whole range of operations, from caustic soda production, using old mercury electrolysis cells, bleach manufacture from the caustic soda and chlorine, oxygen, wood pulping where wood chips are soaked in caustic to break down the fibers, pulp bleaching to generate white pulp, dewatering and finished paper rolling. I was able to contribute several reports based on testing and design methods learned in my first 2 years at Surrey, which led to several plant operational changes. The other employees and my managers were quite friendly and supportive at the time, although they maintained some distance from me as I was an outsider, and I couldn't ever bring myself to use the same language as them when addressing non-white staff. In fact, my closest confidant became the lad who brought me my tea, Joseph. We had many discussions about how, back in the UK, there were protests and marches held regularly against the apartheid regime, and I even gave him back copies of Bare Facts, blissfully unaware of the problems this would later cause. I found some time to explore the country by means of my somewhat old and unreliable VW estate car. It got me to Durban through some highly impressive scenery, but the most memorable trip was towards the end of my year when I picked up 2 fellow Chem-Eng students and we drove to the Kruger National Park. By the end of this industrial year we were all broke, of course, and so we slept in the car and picked fruit where we could. A big mistake in the park was when we stopped and got out to have a wash in the Olifants River. We were caught by a park ranger and told in no uncertain terms how dangerous that was. We got back into the car and drove around the corner, to be halted by a pride of lions blocking the road. Gulp. Later, we were chased by a bull elephant and had to reverse rapidly to get away. We drove back on a high and feeling very privileged to have seen such sights. My elation didn't last long. Next morning, upon arrival at the factory, I was told to report to the personnel department. I assumed this was because I was finishing soon. There I was met by two stern-faced men in suits. "Mr. Kirk?" they asked in heavy Afrikaans accents. "We are from the Bureau of State Security and have reason to believe you are giving out anti-government propaganda material." Boss was the pseudonym for the dreaded security police, shortly to become infamous for the Steve Biko incident. They searched my room, jackets off, shoulder rigs on display to intimidate me, and read all my personal letters and diaries, whilst I figured out that lending Joseph my bare facts was what this was all about. "If you weren't leaving next week, we would deport you now," I was told in no uncertain terms, an ignominious end to my year. Thankfully, the regime eventually collapsed, and although I haven't returned, I remember it as the year I grew up and definitely came away with a new respect for British democracy, tolerance, and multicultural awareness, as well as some new skills in practical chemical engineering.